Thank you very much for inviting me to Athens in Greece. It's an honor and it's always fun to come here. I will focus on my glasses. I will focus on two topics. First, a little bit general about the work we have to do in kind of prevention or developing sense, and then about the need of multi-professional cooperation. This is our logo, and this is the Swedish Competence Center for Child Abuse and Neglect that started in 2015. We have to collect and spread evidence-based knowledge related to children and violence, and our primary target group are all professionals working with children. So it's preschool teachers, social workers, psychiatrists, whatever, lawyers, and so on. So we should provide knowledge for them to help them to do their work better in a way. We are also hosting network, and one of the most important network we host in Sweden is the network for the Child Advocacy Center in Sweden or in Europe called Barnafrid. And then we should cooperate with the authorities and all the different NGOs. We should provide with education at the university. And a very important point is that we should identify areas of need for development and yearly report these to the Swedish government, so we could up what is lacking in Sweden, and usually perhaps a couple of years later we have reached that goal. I come back a little bit to that. And we should also be a link between research and practice and clinic, and we do also a little bit of research by ourselves. I would talk a little bit about what we have adopted to our unit or to the Swedish context, and that's the 7 strategies from the Inspire. Inspire is the World Health Organization's contribution to the newly established partnership, the global partnership to end violence against children, and it's also part of the Agenda 2030. And especially as the goal 16.A, that's important. And as our ambassador said, Sweden are also a pathfinder country, so we have also the possibility to take initiatives and perhaps invite to conferences or education or spread our knowledge and also learn from others, of course. The 7 strategies goes, I would say, it's a good way for governments or states to look after, to see where are we now, what have we done, and what needs to be done in 7 different areas, from implementing enforcement of laws. For example, we could see in Sweden we had the anti-spanking law already in 1979. We have a law against buying sex in Sweden 1999, and last year we had a law that says that we need to have consent when it comes to sex. So we are working with the laws, and in the best of words, I would say the norms and values changes before the law. And that was the case when it comes to the anti-spanking law. There was lots of debates and writing in Sweden and television program. So when the law was taken, it was fully accepted. I would say that's not the usual with laws. You have to work with it afterwards instead, after the parliament has taken the law. You should also work with a safe environment, and that could be everything from safe schoolyards, helplines, but of course important here is education of teachers, preschool teachers and so on, so they could identify problems among children, even then child abuse and neglect. Parent and caregiver support. We have baby health clinics in Sweden that approximately 90% of parents belong to or go to. They have the vaccination program, but you can go there and have consultation if you have worries about your child and so on. We also have income and economic strengthening for parents with children, so you can have rather long birth leave after you have had your child, up to 1 year, and it's nowadays shared between mothers and fathers. And you can also have sick leaves if your children are sick and have to stay home from school, for example. We have response and support service that we need always to improve. We were criticized by the Children's Rights Committee that the facility for help, support and treatment was too vague in Sweden, so we are working on that right now. And then it's the question about education and skill. And I can say that the Barnombudsperson here said that we have the legislation in Sweden from 1942 with the mandatory sex education in schools in Sweden. I would say that education has deteriorated, so we are now planning for a new one. And if I had any say, I would say it would be an education for how to be a good peer. It should be based more or focused on relations, not on sex. Sex is a part of the education, but not the focus. So that, I hope, will be the new curriculum in Sweden, and then it will run from preschool through the whole compulsory school system. So that's what you can do. That was a little bit of examples from Sweden when it comes to inspire. Every country that has signed this in the UN Declaration, Agenda 2030, has to look what they are doing and what they need to be doing in the future. Well, there are 10 more years to go. Another important thing that is a bit a part of this to end violence against children is also the child advocacy movement that we took from the United States, and Chris Newlin will talk perhaps a little bit more about that later, via Reykjavik on Iceland to Europe. And it's also supported by the Lanzarote Convention as a model how to make a child-friendly setting when it comes to children that have been subjected to different types of crimes. It started usually with sexual abuse crimes, but we in Sweden also have domestic violence and physical abuse. You can see on the map that we will very much welcome Greece to our family. In the Nordic countries there are lots of barnahus. In Sweden there are 32 barnahus right now, 11 in Norway and 6 in Denmark. So in the northern part of Europe it's rather well covered. I will talk with this as a starting point. And this is a picture we used in a report when we did a quality investigation of the Swedish Barnahus a couple of years ago. We're talking about the 4 rooms: a room for criminal investigation, a room for physical examination, a room for protection, and for mental health. And of course, each Barnahus could also be a center for education and research in their region for all professionals working in that region. So it just has to do with the dimension and the staff, of course, at each Barnahus. I would say that the main pillar for Barnahus, for example, is that the state parties has an obligation to protect the child from all forms of physical and mental violence, injuries or abuse, neglect or negligent treatment, maltreatment or exploitation, including sexual abuse. So that's what we have undertaken when we signed the UN Convention of the Children's Rights. Especially the Article 2 is important when it comes to the more judicial point of it, that we must, in the rights of the child should be heard in any judicial and administrative proceedings affecting the child, either directly or through a representative or an appropriate body, in a manner consistent with the procedural rules of the national law. And so it's very important both to hear the child, forensic interviewing, but also to understand the child's developmental age in order to do the interview correct. There are, for that, different protocols that you can follow when you should do forensic interviewing with children. Most of them are developed in the United States. Most of them are also used in Europe. And we are trying to educate and teach. In Sweden, it's the police men that do it, or women, mostly women, that do the interviews. So they are specially trained, but I would say they are usually lacking knowledge about children. They come from a police background with no education in children and children's need and developmental stage and so on. So they have to learn a lot about that together with the interview techniques. If you do what we call evidence-based interviews, it will give and uses open questions. It will give you longer and better statements from the child, more open statement, more details, and more allegation of intrafamilial abuse is also reached when you use, for example, sequential interviewing. That results in more convictions and better, in the end, better protection of children, because that is always in the core interest that children should be in the center for everything we do. The second room is the importance of good medical examinations. And of course we are following protocols even there, but there's not so much written. The Pediatric Association has one in Sweden, for example. I think they have in the United States too, for example, and UK too. So we follow them. But what you have seen in research that if you have a multidisciplinary team, you will do more medical exams than if you don't have. So the importance of cooperation affect. And my theory is that when people work together, they also put pressure on each other. So you have to do your very best. You can't do it by yourself. When you do it together, there will be a pressure that you should do it in time, and you should do it because other people are depending on the examination. In my view, that's my more personal view, is that every child that has been subjected to abuse police investigation, when it had reached that level, you should have a medical examination. That's a little bit questioned, because some say that perhaps the child will feel intimidated and not prepared and so on. And you have to take that into consideration. But I think as a ground rule, every child should be examined. It's a little bit easier when it comes to physical abuse, because then the abuse is usually happening in close time to the report. Sexual abuse could be that the girl are talking about the abuse a half a year later, and of course you won't find many things then if it's not still going on. The third room is the room for the risk assessment, and there are also protocols you can follow, usually also developed in the United States, and some I remember is, I think, both from Australia and from UK. And I don't think it's important what kind of protocol you follow. It's that you do a structured interview or risk assessment, that you don't forget any aspects of the child's life. in the assessment. And in the risk assessment room, there are short times decisions that the social welfare has to do, and it's can the child stay at home or should it be remote in Sweden, usually foster care, family care? Or the other question is, what is this family in need of for kind of support, intervention or treatment in the long run? The fourth room is more my room. As a child psychiatrist, I'm more familiar with that room. And then we have the Article 39 as a support. And as I said, Sweden has got criticism because we are not following the UN Convention that every child has the right to be assessed and, if needed, having treatment. And I would say still there are too few children that got both assessment and treatment. We're getting better. We have some projects in Sweden, but we have to work with this because it's the mental health sector, I would say, that today is lacking understanding of these children's need. They are not diagnosed in a way. They have not a neuropsychiatric diagnosis and are not perhaps suicidal, and then they say it's nothing for us. And it's for them, or otherwise we need to have another organization for traumatized children in Sweden. And why is it of interest to do this kind of assessment? I would say it followed the Article 39, but also it should ensure children a better and healthier life. And on the short-term effect, we know that post-traumatic stress syndrome could be a very intense handicap for children, and it usually doesn't disappear by itself. You have to approach it and give treatment. We know from David Finkelhorst's studies that post-traumatization or re-victimization are very important, so you need to intervene early. There could be post-traumatization even when the first police report is done, but the risk is that it will go on and on and on. And one special question is also the sexualized behavior. I would say, when I teach social work, I would say, you can't leave a child that has been sexually abused having a sexualized behavior, because she will most likely be abused again. So you need to take that serious. And then we have vulnerable group, as Kevin talked about, the children with disabilities that for example, in the study you showed is approximately 4 times more suspected for different kinds of child abuse. In Sweden it's 2 times in our study, so we are a little bit lower, but it's still 2 times more often that children with disability has been subjected for different kinds of abuse. And finally, we know that we have today evidence-based treatment that functions, and the main treatment we have in Sweden is the trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. But there are also other forms as EMDR and so on. So, why should we have an interprofessional or multi-professional collaboration? What we have seen in research, and I think Chris could talk a little bit more about that, is it increases the professionality and coordinated response. They shorten the investigation time and increases the prosecution rates and decrease the access to medical care and lower also the cost, which is fun for the politicians to hear. And above all, it also increases the satisfaction both among children and among parents. Of course, that's very difficult research because few children can compare one model with another, so you can just compare the satisfaction in different models, so to speak. The multidisciplinary team have different tasks. and you can never take them away from them, so you have to have them to be very professional on each task. Law enforcement, has crime been conducted, prosecution, can I prove the case in court? Second row, is there evidence of abuse? Does the child need treatment, medical treatment? Child Protective Service, is the child safe or other children at risk? And the fourth room, does the child family need mental health service? What type of service would help the most? So, and finally, that's my view. In order to stop child abuse, we need to work together, since multi-knowledge is needed from different disciplines to do a whole job. It takes a society to help an abused child. Thank you.